Greetings on this eve of the United Nations COP26 Climate Change Conference. The meeting whose decisions so many of us around the world believe to be crucial to the future of humanity and the natural world. I'm the co-chair of the National Religious Diversity Centre of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm happy now to introduce this conversation between two people who've been important to the centre at this time. Dr. Paul Blaschke, a Jewish person from Wellington. He's been a member of the centre's Climate Change Advisory Group, who produced the statement for government to be endorsed by leaders and interfaith groups of Aotearoa, New Zealand, urging our government to take truly ambitious goals to Glasgow, to the conference, ambitious goals for our nation. And secondly, Rod Oram, who's agreed to be our man in Glasgow. And he has promised to keep us in touch with what's going on in that city around the big conference, because there is a lot going on, organised and convened by interfaith and religious people from all around the world. It's an amazing thing that's happened this year as religions and interfaith people have voiced their concerns for the future of our world. And Rod has been invited by Interfaith Scotland to be part of some of their events. And we're very grateful to Interfaith Scotland for that. And so we're very eager to hear from you, Rod, how things go over the next week or so. And I hope that we will hear much from you. So let me hand over to you two. I'm looking forward to your conversation, and I'm going to join others as they listen to you. So thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jocelyn. And kia ora koutou, and special kia ora, Rod. It's lovely to see you on the other side of the world. I think you're in Birmingham at the moment, but not that far from your destination in Glasgow. We've missed you a lot on the working group for this statement over the last few weeks, but we know that you are doing a great job over there in the UK. And so I thought that it would be good for you to start by just painting us a picture of what you've been doing over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and of the mood that you sense around you generally, as I imagine the whole country and certainly the circles that you're moving in are getting ready for this momentous conference. Just tell us a bit about the scene, please.
Well, kia ora tātou, Paul and Jocelyn. It's a great pleasure to be on this call with you. I arrived in the UK 5 weeks ago and spent almost a week in Scotland, where I landed, because I have family there east of Edinburgh. And I was trying to get various interviews with people in Scottish government and wasn't successful. But it was wonderful to touch base family-wise there, because that's a very important place for us as a family, a place of gathering at my older sister's home. Then I traveled down here to Birmingham in the Midlands. And Birmingham's important to me at a personal level because I was born and grew up here, although I left when I finished school and went to university elsewhere, never lived back in Birmingham since, but often visited. But Birmingham is a fascinating place because on one hand, it's very much the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So the scientists, the engineers, the entrepreneurs who are based in Birmingham and around it were hugely important to the Industrial Revolution, great pioneers of steam engines, for example, and many other technologies. But Birmingham has shifted hugely over the decades, and its economic nadir was in the early 70s, as the rise of China meant a lot of business left Birmingham and went to China and elsewhere in the world. But at the same time, there was a great influx of people into Birmingham. So Birmingham has changed very significantly demographically in the many decades I've been gone. So now Birmingham has the youngest demography, the youngest demographic profile of any city in Europe. And that's palpable on the streets of Birmingham and in the people you meet. It's also a very diverse community culturally and ethnically, with very large Muslim and Hindu and many other populations as well. There are all sorts of places of worship, an enormous diversity. And yet there is also, I think, some real energy in the Anglican community that I grew up with. So, for example, I've been back worshipping for a few Sundays at the parish church I grew up in as a young boy. And the church is in good heart and very engaged on all these issues, not the least of which being the climate ones, but also great innovation in industry. So I've enjoyed tracing through from those roots way back 200 years ago, early in the Industrial Revolution, through my childhood here, through to Birmingham it is today. But at the same time, as I've been tracking that, I've also been tracking COP and the build up to it. And the UK government, in many respects, has been more organised on this, not just as the host of COP, but also in terms of its own programmes and policies. So finally, Tuesday of last week, the government unveiled its net zero strategy. There was a lot to recommend and to be glad of in that, some significant gaps, some things neglected and all the rest. And also, fascinatingly, and perhaps it's a subject we might come back to, great tensions within the government, great tensions between the Chancellor of the Exchequer, for example, and the Secretary for Industry, for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy in terms of the UK government's response. There is also a very big civil society commitment. So I've seen that to COP, I've seen that here in various organizations that I've been dealing in and in local government. The Birmingham City Council, for example, a few weeks ago adopted a very ambitious transport strategy, which is very much designed to reduce the role of cars in transport here in Birmingham, which is a bit of a mission, seeing as this is very much motor city, both in terms of its industrial base, but also in terms of the city structure and transport networks. So all that's been going on. And at the same time, I've also been scanning a lot about the international response as countries and civil society prepares for COP. And there's lots to be excited about in terms of all the issues, all the initiatives being brought to the table in Glasgow. And officially that all starts on Sunday with sort of the official welcome, and then the World Leaders session starts Monday and Tuesday. I'll come back to the rest of the COP timetable later. But for me, it's constantly a question of navigating through those high hopes, those huge needs, and some of the political and economic reality, the pushback by vested interests. It gets very complicated. So it's always a question, always a challenge to be keeping all of that in perspective, to try to understand how I personally, but and the rest of humanity navigates through this extraordinarily rich, hopeful but contentious agenda here for the next couple of weeks.
Well, that's a great scene you've set, and I will just take you up on a couple of those points. And make it perhaps a bit more particular to the reason that we've been brought here together to talk under the aegis of the Religious Diversity Centre. So I'm just wondering, within that complexity that you've been talking about, within the tensions with all those different streams within UK society, let alone the international one, would you Can you say a little bit more specific about faith-based and interfaith organisations, the people you've been talking to, what you've heard in the media? How have they been trying to come into this scene? You've largely talked about government and the national government and the scene in Birmingham in a local area. What about the faith-based organisations? Are they trying to, or how are they trying to shape and have an influence over the proceedings that are about to kick off?
Very much so. And this is working at a global level. So there will be a very substantial interfaith aspect to COP in Glasgow, which will wonderfully start at 2 p.m. on Sunday in George Square in Glasgow, a central meeting place. Sadly, because of some restrictions, I think driven as much by COVID, although I say in brackets here, there are very few formal restrictions. Mask wearing is mandatory, even though case levels are high. But anyway, the actual attendance in George Square on Sunday will be limited to 500 people. And part of that is a very practical response, because from that gathering, which will be all the faiths of the world, I think it's going to be the most extraordinary religious gathering, if you like, that I personally have ever been to. We will then go off on a series of pilgrimages to places of worship around the city. I have no way of measuring. I'm looking forward to asking old hands at this, whether this is going to be a bigger and more cohesive, more coordinated, more determined expression of interfaith commitment on all of this than in past COPs. My sense it is, but I'll be checking that out. So that's the very big picture. Then Interfaith Scotland, as hosts in Glasgow, have been playing a really important role. They are a very well-established, very effective group. Because the population of Scotland these days is just as diverse as it is, for example, here in Birmingham. So Maureen Sear, who leads Interfaith Scotland, has been doing a fabulous job coordinating all that. And just a little example of that, when I was that first week outside Edinburgh, Maureen came to Edinburgh along with a Shiite Muslim group from Glasgow who were on an interfaith pilgrimage to Edinburgh, and they'd been going around during the day to various secular and spiritual places in Edinburgh. And then their last stop of the day was in the Edinburgh City Council chambers, where they were greeted and hosted by the Lord Provost, essentially the mayor of Edinburgh. And Maureen invited me along to that. And it was just so fabulous to go to that meeting in the venerable Edinburgh City Council chambers. And every person in the room, and there were a whole bunch of faiths represented there, not just the people on the pilgrimage. Pretty much everybody had this strong Scottish accent, regardless of their religion and their faith. And you just felt overwhelming that they were hugely Scottish. Even if they'd only been there, had come as migrants or refugees, or whether they were from families who had come sometime earlier, a generation or two earlier. And this huge sense of Scottishness, but a wonderful expression of the faith, of interfaith relationships too. So that was a real highlight very early on in the trip. And then when I come down here to Birmingham, again, I'm seeing that strong interfaith work at hand. I must admit, though, that getting to know the cultural diversity of Birmingham I've been able to devote, sadly, less time to that than other preparation for COP. So I haven't dived as deeply into those issues here. although I'd just make one comment in passing. I did have a chance to go to my old school and do something which I offered to do, planned to do, which was run a mock COP26 one afternoon with the pupils in the sixth form, the last 2 years of the school. And looking around, cracky, almost 100 students that we organized into a mock COP26. And there was this extraordinary ethnic diversity there that was very different from when I went to Solihull School a long time ago. And that's obviously a very vital, a very lively part of the school. So that's some of the things I've been seeing.
Terrific. And you would be interested with that picture of the diversity that you've struck. On a smaller scale, you'll know that last week we had this function very close to Parliament in Wellington to present our interfaith and religious leaders' statement to the government. And I think for many of the people present, really one of the main highlights was the 4 people who actually made the short statements and the presentation of the statement to the minister. And they also represented that diversity. So the first one was a leader well known to you, Archbishop Phillipson, from the Archbishop of the Anglican Church. We had a young Hindu woman, Mandira Shiraj, who is studying climate change science. We had a Sun Liu Vai from Palmerston North, who's a Catholic and a leader in the Pacific community in Pacifica churches. And perhaps most eloquent of all was Rehana Ali, probably known to both of you as a leader in the Muslim community and such an important role she played in the aftermath of that terrible mosque shooting. So that for me was an incredibly gratifying part of our own ceremony. And when the minister spoke afterwards, in his words of response, he said he was, and he looked as though he was quite genuinely touched by the diversity of our group, not only those 4 speakers, but the small group that we had there. I did want to ask you one question which you may or may not have had a chance to observe, but a question that's often been important for us in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that is, do you see alliances developing internationally between faith-based organisations and Indigenous peoples internationally? Of course, as you know, that has been a really important theme in many faiths, and particularly in the Christian churches in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I just wonder whether that's been something that is a growing theme internationally. Will you be expecting to see those kinds of alliances, common interests being expressed in the COP negotiations?
Yes, and I'm expecting to see that on the ground in George Square on Sunday. But and again, not just from an interfaith point of view, but in terms of the COP negotiations as well, there is going to be much more, there's going to be significantly more, still not enough, and still only relatively a little, emphasis and engagement with Indigenous people. Very interestingly, it's coming through on the land use side of negotiations. So I ran across a very interesting quote yesterday from a senior official at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization about how this was a significant shift in these negotiations compared with others, about the role of Indigenous people in land use, and not just protecting their rights and their land, but learning from their practices too. And I'm very excited about this because I think that that's something very significant we bring from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And looking at the video of that wonderful hour you spent on the lawn in front of Parliament that you sent me, I was so struck and it's not that I take this for granted at all when I'm in New Zealand, but watching it from afar just had so much greater resonance. So the whole nature of our statement and those references to Tauriti and Indigenous people here and then in the Pacific, but the composition and just the style of the format of that hour. But for me, the most remarkable one was when the minister, James Shaw, begins his response with essentially a blessing, paying homage to the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. And I thought that was remarkable.
And he even talked about the spirit within him.
Yeah. And well, I thought that's a remarkable quality and attribute and spirituality for that is admirable to find in anyone, but particularly gratifying to find in a climate minister as he goes to Glasgow. And I've known James a long time. I'm just going to gently ask him about that when I see him in Glasgow, because I'm really keen to explore the extent to that helps him in his very difficult journey and his very difficult task. He has, you see it here with politicians here, you see it around the world, he has this enormously difficult task of trying to bring people together in the political sphere. It's phenomenally difficult. And therefore I was very intrigued that that's how he was giving expression to that as he received this statement.
And I think the other thing that we should point out about James Shaw before we leave that is that he acknowledged quite specifically, quite directly that we as faith-based organisations were reaching sections of the community that he could not reach as a politician, and he urged us to take advantage of that advantage. And again, that was a gratifying acknowledgement of what we a large part of what we were trying to do. So yeah, yes, please take him up on that in Glasgow. Look, time's marching past. I want to just spend a few minutes perhaps talking about a couple of aspects of the negotiations to come and your thinking about those in ahead that are of particular interest in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the first one I want to just ask you about issues to do with historical emissions and to what extent that comes into the equation in trying to deal with responsibility for emissions reductions going forward. You know, you hear this question about historical emissions and the fact that richer and longer developed countries have got to their position by having a much larger historical cumulative emissions profile, and therefore that should be taken into account in the obligations and the commitments they make going forward. We were, in our own statement, we touched on this, but we didn't really have time to develop it. How important do you think that particular issue will play in the negotiations? And do you see any particular relevance for that for Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Yes, it's fundamentally important in terms of a sense of any acknowledgement of equity and responsibility, but it's very largely ignored. The best place or the simplest way of giving expression to that concept is the work of Climate Action Tracker, very easily find online, where they note each country's NDC, how that tracks against 1.5 degrees. But they've also got a calculation that they call a fair share commitment, i.e. As a developed country, that you've emitted a lot to get to where you are, therefore you have a bigger burden of reduction. However, that doesn't flow through at all strongly in negotiations. And in fact, that central concept of how to shoulder responsibility and respond accordingly was what dogged climate negotiations all the way through the Kyoto Protocol and tried to come up with something different afterwards. And Paris was really important because it broke that logjam there by just having each country put its own nationally determined contribution on the table and see how that aggregated up. And therefore, yes, encouraging, demanding, pushing countries to do better. But the whole dynamic of these negotiations has shifted dramatically because so much is happening out in civil society with technology, clean energy, with economics, a lot more money from the private sector flowing into climate responses, completely dwarfing whatever money a government is prepared to put in to help other countries. And so, for example, news yesterday, latest assessment from the UK government about developed countries' commitments to finally get their contribution to developing countries up to $100 billion a year. In aggregate, I mean, that's nonsense. I mean, that was set in Paris 6 years ago, and the level only got up to $80 billion last year. And the view of the UK government yesterday was that it won't hit 100 billion until 2023, which caused quite a backlash rightly from developing countries. So that government money going to developing countries is very modest, and they're failing to do it. But there's so much else happening through funds flowing through business, through investors, through other channels, through multinational organizations, that gives you a lot of hope. So very crucially, the dynamic that shifted here in the negotiations, and I think we'll get by far the best expression of this here at Glasgow compared with previous COPs, is that it's no longer about trying to work out how to share the pain of responding to the climate crisis. It's about how to share the gains of it. So how do we fast forward and help countries achieve those gains? And there are all sorts of simple parallels. So for example, in telecommunications, there were lots of countries in Asia and Africa that never managed to build networks of copper wires for telephones. They just they passed that technology by and went straight to mobile phones. And so countries like Nigeria have extraordinary telecoms that are based entirely on mobile. So we're seeing the same thing with energy. And so there was an appeal or a commitment made by South Africa yesterday, which has prodigious amount of coal-fire powered generation of electricity, making an appeal to as much to global business and financial institutions than to other governments, that they need $30 billion to be able to invest in clean energy production so they can get off coal as fast as possible. So that's how the dynamics change. And so whilst I take the political negotiations seriously, because we still need those overarching agreements, we still need the rule books so we can keep each other accountable. That will run into the sand. That won't achieve as much as we need to at Glasgow. So I'll be watching that closely, but I'll be taking most of my encouragement and hope from what I'm seeing from civil society and the expressions and commitments that it makes at Glasgow.
Well, that's really fascinating, and that's an insight that I really didn't expect to get from this discussion. I hadn't appreciated that shift. It's also really encouraging in terms of what we've been thinking about, is that because thinking about it the way that you've mentioned is a way of putting into practical terms and implementation policies the principles of just transition and climate justice. If it's not just a case of pain, but it's also gain. So there are there are positive things to be shared as well as negative things to be shared in that just transition. And perhaps that's something that we really have to look at fleshing out in the months and years to come in New Zealand, even more than in other places. So look, I think we're going to be coming to the end of our discussion. And I just want to ask to finish on a practical question, because we realise, and the Minister challenged us to realise, that our job is not done, having made the statement. In fact, possibly our job is only just beginning. So I just wonder if you've got any advice for us in the faith-based organisations in this next period, over COP and immediately after. As you know, we weren't particularly successful in getting mainstream media attention. Is that may not be the only way that we have of being effective. So just any advice that you have from where you are now in the next little while for us as faith-based organisations trying to have a useful role in this great movement.
Yeah. I'm going to enjoy giving you this answer, speaking as somebody who's have a long career and still a bit left in mainstream media. That mainstream media doesn't matter anymore because it's so distracted by, I was going to say cats, that's unfair to cat lovers, whatever. So it's all about community building. And so therefore our ability in our diverse faiths to, within our faith community, encourage people on this journey in practical terms and helping them change and improve their lives from a climate and sustainability point of view. Because it's, of course, these co-crises of climate breakdown and ecosystem collapse. They're causing each other. And so the solution of one helps us solve the other. So it's these co-crises we're dealing with. And so that's about how we live. And so if we start in our own faith communities, whether it be our parish church or our synagogue or our temple or our mosque, wherever we meet, and then encourage each other on that journey and then be able to reach out. I just feel hugely strongly that we won't do enough, humanity won't do enough about this until we care enough. And we won't care enough until we rediscover some sort of spiritual relationship with the living systems of the earth, our life support system. And while the statement on October the 1st, St. Francis Day, at the Vatican from the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church and about 40 other faith leaders had an awful lot of merit to it, the word spirit or spiritual only turned up twice in that whole declaration right at the end. And so I think we need to get, and I raise this challenge personally, I take this personal challenge myself, to be able to talk to people about spirituality and to be able to offer that as a way to guide us, to help us, to encourage us. And I have this huge feeling that because that knowledge of creation and that core of spirituality, which is common to all the great faiths of the world, I feel that as we work together on these issues, that will help us find greater peace and joy and cooperation and progress for us as faiths working together. So that's why I just am hugely, I just think that what's going on in the interfaith movement is so profound, because yes, it's about the practical side of stuff, but it's also about the spiritual side, which I think will be, the enlivening thing for us through all of this. It will bring us wisdom, it will bring us courage, it will bring us relationship with creation. That's what I'm very excited about. And so the extent to we in Aotearoa can do that, but also very powerfully bring to our Māori and Mātauranga Māori to this, that Māori worldview, that Māori knowledge. Wonderful seeing, as we mentioned, our climate minister giving expression to that. But that's turning up in all sorts of amazing places in New Zealand. Even the Reserve Bank of New Zealand can very articulately define itself into our Māori terms. And so for Te Reti to be so important in our statement and in the way we're approaching these things. And the fact that I was able to go back to my old school, I'm sorry, this is a bit emotional. And I started by giving them my pepeha. It took me a long time in New Zealand. Gosh, I'd been in New Zealand almost 20 years before I felt that I wanted to do that in a meeting. It was one with my Edmund Hillary Fellowship, and it felt right to do. But it just was so remarkable to go back to my school and give my pepeha, which names the Lickey Hills on the outskirts of Birmingham and the River Ray, which runs through Birmingham, on which the banks of the River Ray, an Anglian tribe, founded Birmingham several thousand years ago on the banks of the river, which it flows right through the center of town here, a tiny little river, horribly polluted by industry and everything else, but it can get new life. It was just such a remarkable moment for me.
Thank you.
That's fantastic.
Tēnā koe, Rod. And as you make your way to Glasgow tomorrow, you take our prayers and our thoughts with you. And we hope to keep in touch with you. So go well. Ngā mihi nui. Tēnā koe, Paul. I've enjoyed that conversation, and thank you both very much indeed. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you, Jocelyn, and everybody.